The second thing that Peter calls us to in the list of things that he says that we're to prioritize above all else because the end of all things is at hand, the second thing he lists is hospitality. He writes in 1 Peter 4:9, show hospitality to one another without grumbling. Hospitality, at least in this instance, is not focused on those that we know well or those that we're comfortable with. It's a way in which we approach and open doors to people who don't yet belong with us or aren't yet one of us. In fact, the word he uses literally could be translated as love the stranger or be generous to guests. And this is not a new concept for the church. It's not a new concept for God's people. It's not a new command. It's something that God has been expecting his people, telling his people to do since, well, he was gathering a people. All the way back in the Old Testament, the Israelites were commanded to treat strangers as if they were native born Israelites. That's Leviticus 19:33 through 34. In the New Testament, the writer of Hebrews says not to neglect hospitality because some have entertained angels unaware. That's Hebrews 13:2. Paul demonstrates hospitality to be a mark of maturity because as he includes it in both of his elder qualification lists in 1 Timothy 3 and in Titus 1. But then also he commands us to it as a response to the grace we've received in Romans 12:13. So it's not just for the mature, it's the response that it's the right response that we are to have towards the stranger, toward the guest, simply because we've received God's grace. See, not only should our meetings and our Sunday mornings be markedly different because we are gathering together sacrificially, intentionally offering agape love to one another, but because we are going the extra mile to make the guest feel as if they're a member of the family. I can tell you this makes a huge difference in a church like ours because when a visitor comes in a church our size, they know everybody else in the room knows one another and they feel like the odd man out. I'll always remember a story. It happened early on. We were still in the school, but a young woman attended a community group earlier in the previous week, and she decides as a result, she decides she's going to come to church that Sunday morning. She shows up, she comes in, she sits down, she sits through the service, she gets up and she leaves. And not once, no one greeted her, no one said hello to her, no one sought to make her feel welcome. It seemed to her, as it was told to me later, it seemed to her as if no one cared that she was there. It's noticeable when we drop the ball in this. So we have to be purposeful and intentional about it. We're a close knit group. We're a collection of close knit groups. We are our community group model with big groups and small groups. It lends itself to this kind of problem. Now, we don't need to make apologies for that. We don't need to. This is a biblical model. It's what we see happening in the book of Acts that they're gathering at the temple, they're gathering in one another's homes. It's okay to do this. It's right and good for us to develop these close knit relationships as a collection of close knit groups. There's nothing wrong with that. But hospitality then guards us from becoming cliques. It guards our close knit groups and our close relationships from becoming cliques because hospitality demands that we're always leaving room for another person to join, that we're always making space for a stranger to feel like family, to feel like they belong with us. The most telling part, though, of Peter's command is that we're to do this without grumbling. This is not an easy thing for us to do. It's not an easy thing for it's natural for us to gravitate towards one another and gravitate to those conversations with people that we know and are comfortable with, that we belong to. But we're to do this without grumbling. We're to do it not because we've been coerced or commanded. We're to do it because we've received God's grace, because we have a new desire to make others feel welcome. There's a message being sent by a church that doesn't welcome strangers, that doesn't make their guests feel welcome. But I can assure you, especially in a church like ours, that message, that thing it's revealing about us isn't good. In the interest of organization and intentionality, then, that we've developed a team that we call the hospitality team. That they're responsible to get that hospitality ball rolling. And so they greet people at the doors. They help them set expectations for the day. They show up early. They make coffee. They and get the building ready to host our guests. But once a person's past that front door, once the person's sipping on their coffee and sitting in a seat waiting for the service to begin, it becomes the responsibility of every one of our members to be hospitable, to love the stranger, to be generous to the guest. See, Peter doesn't relegate the responsibility of hospitality to those who are spiritually gifted to do it. He calls every one of us. He makes it the responsibility of every member to be hospitable, to love the stranger, to be generous to guests. In a culture like ours, where the Sunday morning gathering is almost always the first live interaction that we've had with a visitor, with a prospective member, Sunday morning missionaries are going to exercise great influence as they recognize that hospitality is necessary past that smile and handshake at the door, but should be woven into every aspect of our gathering. Sunday morning missionaries are integral parts of tearing down barriers and building bridges as across the language we use, across the culture that's developed among us, across the close-knit relationships, the style of worship, the awkwardness that we all often feel just because of our own internal insecurities. Sunday morning missionaries recognize that as a church family, we don't have to use Sunday mornings simply as a time primarily focused on ourselves, but that especially during the portion of our gatherings before and after the service, before the singing starts and after the singing ends, that there's a great opportunity to make strangers feel as if they've always been a part of our church. We may not actually succeed in making every person feel welcome, but Sunday morning missionaries are going to strive to do their part to see it done. Now, think back to the first time that you visited our church and you walked into one of our gatherings. Maybe it's another church of similar size. There's lots of churches you could go into and no one's going to know you're visiting because no one really knows one another. But in a church like ours, think of that first gathering. Think of that first entry. For some people, this is so intimidating. For others, it's just downright scary. They're extremely nervous. Did it matter less that second, third, fourth time? No. We should be offering hospitality. We should be seeking to love the stranger and be generous to guests until those guests are part of the family. Now, imagine a church family that doesn't allow itself to be so introverted or so self-focused on Sunday mornings that guests could come and go without being engaged and being made to feel welcome. Imagine a church whose love for Jesus and one another has resulted in so much good in their own lives that they want everyone who visits with them to experience that goodness. And imagine a church that desires to worship God by making room for others to see his glory and worship as if they've always been part of the family. Imagine a church full of Sunday morning missionaries that love guests just as much as they love one another, and they show hospitality without grumbling. What do we need as the Way Church? What do we need to do to become that church? What do you need to do? What do you need to change about the ways you attend and participate in our Sunday morning gatherings to help us become that church?